Assalamu alaikum guys. In this video we'll talk about HTTP clients and Laravel. So let's start. First of all, HTTP client is a minimal API for Guzzle HTTP client. So if we open this link here, as mentioned in Laravel documentation, it implements or make it easy for using this Guzzle with Laravel. And by the way, Guzzle also implements curl and streams and sockets for PHP and saves time also, so it's make easy for easy thing. So let's start. I will use this JSON placeholder for sending requests, get, request, post, and so on. So here in my controller, I have created a controller called learn HTTP controller, and here I have created this endpoint. So if I go here and if I open it now, author.test, it works correctly, and I will open learn HTTP. It works also. So the first thing here, I will send a get request for getting a post. So I will say here response, and using HTTP, I will disable copilot, by the way. Right? Using HTTP, I will use it automatically here, this facade, and I will say get method because I'm using get, right? And now I will paste the URL here, this URL for getting a post, this one here. And if I open it in a new tab, as you can see, it returns only one post. And here, for example, 2, 3, and so on. So I will use this URL here. And because it returns JSON, I will say JSON method. Here is JSON. And now let's dump the response to see the result. Send request here. And as we can see, it returns user ID 1, post ID number 1, and works correctly. What is the difference between JSON and body here? The body method returns string. So if I make it body here, refresh, as we can see, it's completely string, not JSON, right? And also, by the way, it's for JSON, it returns array access or implements array access interface, which means here JSON, we can directly, even without JSON, if it returns JSON automatically, we can directly use arrays here. So if I say ID, for example, because it implements array access, here it returns 1. If I say a user ID, returns also user ID, for example, a title, I think, as we can see here. So it automatically implements array in case of returning JSON, right? Also, if you want to learn the status of the request or of the response, we can use status method. So if I go here and I will say status, now refresh, it returns 200, which means success, right? Also, we can convert the response to collection using collect method. So I will say here collect, and when I refresh, here is the collection has been created with this data here. So now I can say, for example, first, and using methods of collection, or even saying, for example, here title works also, right? Also, we can check if the response is successful or not using successful and failed method. So we can say here successful, it returns boolean true. If failed, it will return false because it's success and returns 200. And also we can get the headers of the response using headers method here. And as we can see, dump of array, content type is application JSON, as we can see, and the rate limit here also. We can check also the redirection. So if we see here redirect, this method, and it doesn't redirect to anything because it returns 200, not 3xx. And also we can check if the error is 400 or in this way, or a client error or not. So if I say here, is it a client error, refresh, it's false because it returns 200 and success. But if I go here and, for example, I will say post ID number 10,000, as we can see, it returns 44. But what if we tried it with 10,000 here? I will say also 10,000. Now refresh. Now it's true. right? Because it returns 404 here. And now if we check the status, check here, it's 404, right? Here is about receiving the response or formatting the response from HTTP facade. The next thing here is sending or posting data here. And by the way, before moving to it, actually, I want to continue with using defined status methods. So if we go here to Laravel documentation, instead of checking if the status is 200 and checking by number, actually we have some predefined methods here represents the keys or the meaning of these status codes. So for example, we can say here in this part for non-existing root here, we can say as not found, right? Which is returns 404. If we open this not found, as we can see, the status equal to 404. And here of all of these functions here. So if we back here again and send request, it's true, right? It returns Boolean, by the way. And for example, we can check any other error here by using these methods. And also k means 200. So if I fix it again here and I will say okay, check, it's true also. It works because I fixed the URL. The next thing here, if we want to use query parameters, for example, so I want to say user, or here something like this, a user ID equal to 1. It works also, but what if, for example, the URL has multiple query parameters? It will be a long string. So instead of that, we can say here, if we use get method, we can use an array, right? Second parameter is a query parameter. So we can say user ID equal to 1. It's the same for user ID here equal to 1, the same result. So now let's try, and I will die and dump JSON here, back and refresh, and as you can see, it returns 10 posts for user ID number 1 here, right? Because also it exists in the documentation here. If we say here in filter resource, filtering resource, here query parameter user ID number 1, and now for example it's converted to collection using a collect method, and I want to let's first see the result here. Collection also of 10 items. I want to return this first element only or first post only. Now also we can use first method for collection. So refresh and it returns the first post here, and also we may use where maybe ID equal to 10, for example, and I will say also first because it's collection. Now refresh, the same result. For example, what if I set it 10,000? It doesn't exist, so it will return null, right? Now let's move to post request or posting data, right? So I will comment it again here, and I will comment this data. Actually, I will remove all of them. And now for posting request, we can say here response again, response, and for HTTP class post, and here's the URL for creating this link here. And the second parameter for post method here is the data we want to post or create. So our keys, as suggested here, this data title, body, and user ID. So I will say title is hello world, for example, and user ID equal to 1, and body is, for example, thank you. And now let's dump the response here, response status, to check if it works or not. Now refresh the page and it returns 201, which means created. So if I check here using created method, if I open it, it implements also the status equal to 201 instead of using if, and it returns true. And if you noticed here, the header's content type must be application JSON, which is by default when sending a request, which is application JSON. So what if we want to change this content type? For example, we can use method here this method before sending, by the way, we can say content type, and setting the content type we want to set. I may say it, for example, plain / text. And now let's see what will happen. No changes. It works correctly also. If we want to change it to maybe using JSON, we can say as JSON for sending JSON data. So if we open as JSON method here, it sets the content type, as we can see, to application / JSON, as it's set automatically here, right? The same result. Now let's try again to work correctly. Sometimes some APIs requires sending form request and attaching this content type. Now we can use as form method. So if I back here again and I say as form, let's check, and also works correctly. So here's some APIs requires JSON as a content type, and others require a URL decoded as it's suggested here, as we can see here, form URL encoded. Also, we may need to send tokens or making authentication. So we can say here with token instead of sending a header here. So we can say with token, it sends bearer token, by the way. So it's, for example, represents this string here. So if I want to send the token as any random data here, it will send it in header authorization as this string bearer here plus our string. And Laravel made it easy using with token method. Also, some APIs requires basic authentication by using username and password directly. So we can say here basic with basic authentication, and it takes the parameter of username and password. If you don't know what is the basic auth is, we can say here basic authentication. It's a prompt actually, authentication here. Yes, as we can see, sometimes when you open some sites, it's required authenticating in the prompt of JavaScript, as we can see here. Actually, it's not a JavaScript, it's prepared by the web server like Nginx or Apache. So this data can be prepared by the server, and it requires username and password. And in Laravel, actually, maybe in Laravel Horizon, for accessing your Horizon monitor, it requires the basic authentication also. So here's what does basic authentication mean, right? The next part here is retries. So sometimes the request failed, and when it failed, we want to make it retries automatically. So we can say here retry method, and as we can see, it takes two parameters. The first parameter is how many times per millisecond. So I want to say here try it 3 times each 500 milliseconds or each half second. In case of failing, we can use when also for using boolean or closures. And this throw method throws error. So if we want to disable throwing error, we can say throw and set it to false for not throwing any error, and continue implementing the code if you don't want to throwing any exceptions. We can also set the timeout of request. So in Laravel, by default, the timeout is 30 seconds here, but we can set it also for 1 second or any number of seconds you want. It's integer, by the way, right? But by default, it's 30 seconds. Also, if we want to adding headers when sending request, we can say here with headers method. Using with headers, it's an array, and the key is the header and its value. So for example, we can use it actually here again. This value, I can say content type here, and its value is application/JSON here. And also we can say it's actually one value. Here I will continue adding semicolon. And let's try to check again here. Refresh, and the same result, right? So I want to check out the JSON or the response of this request after creating a post. So it returns the post that we have created here, hello world and thank you, and it works correctly. What if we change it here, the URL? Now it returns null, and if I would check failed, it will return true because the URL is corrupted. And we can say here, we can check also, is it a server error or not, using server error. Server error means 500xx here. So if we open it, as we can see, less than or equal 500. So if I check again, it's not a server error, it's a client error. Client error, because its status is 404, I think, right? One last thing here is throwing exceptions. So we want to let user know that this URL doesn't work. So if I send a request here, it doesn't throw anything. So for example, I want to say for response here, through if client error, right? Now refresh, and now it throws error, HTTP request returned 404. Or we can say through if, and using any logic we want. For example, if the response status equal to 404, again the same result. But what if the status, for example, throw error? If the status is 400 only, it will not throw anything, right? Another method here, I think, is through if status also. If status equal to 400, throw it. If not throw it. So I want to, for example, throw if the status is 404, send, and the same result. We can also using through method for implementing our own exception. So we can say here function as a closure here, and if we check again, it must throw request exception, or we may say here port 404 maybe. Now refresh, and as we can see, it throws 404. We may also change it 403, and forbidden maybe 400 only, and it's a bad request, right? So you can implement also your own exception, or throwing your own exceptions that you want here. We can dump also our request here using DD before sending. So as we can see, here's our request data, right? The method, and here's our data also that we will send, and our headers here. If we use the content type by default, or here we set it with headers, our headers here. What if we change it to this data, for example? Here is our request again, headers, and here is what we have set. And as you can see here, by default, the HTTP errors is false because it's not throwing errors unless you use through error. And by the way, if you use only response through, by default, it will throw error in case of failing without implementing any closures here. So if I try again now here, I will remove DD, refresh again now, automatically throws the error that received from the API. If I take back DD again, as you can see, here is the default value of Laravel for pending request here. So the timeout is 10 for connection timeout. They are different, by the way, and the timeout is by default, as we mentioned here, it's 30 seconds, and throwing errors here is false, so it will not throw anything in case of getting any errors, right? One last thing here before finishing the video, because the HTTP client implements the Guzzle HTTP client or API, we can also set our Guzzle options here inside our HTTP client or HTTP in Laravel using with options method. So if you use Guzzle request options, or if you want to use one of them, of this data here, you can use them by using with options method here, all of these options, right, of Guzzle. And if you want to use them, you can use them using with options method by using this method here, array key value, and the source is from Guzzle API. Here's quickly how can we use HTTP client in Laravel. If you found it useful, support me by clicking on like, share, and subscribe. See you in next videos.